The person we're going to look at is someone that put God at the centre of their life, who loved God and listened to him closely. It's a great story of just being obedient and being Christ-like. The person we're looking at is only of one of two people in the Bible that's referred to as a judge and a prophet. The one being Samuel, and it's the other person that we're going to look at today. And it is Deborah, is the person that we are looking at today. So when researching and looking into Deborah, I was just struck by her full focus on God, serving him, listening to his voice, and being very bold to act upon what God was saying to her. She's just a great example of how we should be living our lives. So we're going to look through her story and just look at some of the things that can apply to us today and what we can learn from Deborah. So as I said, Deborah was a judge, but what does that actually mean? So God started an era of judges in the Bible as a rescue plan after Joshua had died. The people of Israel had been disobeying God and they were starting to follow local idols. And basically all of their enemies had started to defeat them and they were ruling them. So when the people then cried for help to get out of that situation, it was then that God sent these temporary military and political leaders, and they were called judges, and they came to save the people through God. And it was God who raised those people up to be judges. So there's actually 15 judges in total, but in the book of Judges, it actually details 12 of those judges. And Deborah is actually the fourth judge, and she's the judge just before Gideon. And the story that we're going to look at is in Judges 4 and 5. I'd encourage you to go and have a read of it. It's a really inspiring story. But at this actual point, the Israelites have been under a brutal oppression by King Jabin, who's the king of Canaan at the time. And they've been under this 20 years of being controlled and just under this oppression from this king. But before we get into that part of the story about how Deborah listened to God and moved on, eventually they had 40 years of peace after what's going to happen. But I thought it might be nice just to have a little look about actually who Deborah was. And in Judges 4, it says a little bit at the beginning about who she was. So as I said, she was a prophet. So that meant she listened to God's word. It wasn't of her words, it was all of God. And she spoke direct advice and truth from God. She was always fair and open, and she welcomed everybody into her setting to be able to be the judge. And she had lots of arguments, fights, disputes, those sorts of things. And they would have come to Deborah to judge over those. She was also listening and guiding. So not only did she listen to God, she would have listened to the people and then gave a fair response based on what God was telling her. But the one part, and this is the part that really draws me and likens a lot to the work I do in the Salvation Army, is that she was accessible. She held her judging duties not in the judge's chambers, but outside. And she actually judged from the foot of a tree, where it was open and accessible to everybody. And that tree then was known as the Palm of Deborah. And working with the Salvation Army, we experience and work with a lot of people from different backgrounds. And that's the one thing that is not very common, being accessible for all. I had a recent experience of supporting somebody, and we went to the family courts in Carmarthen, where Bethel is. And going into that kind of judge's chambers was really unpleasant. It wasn't a very relaxing time at all. It felt like everyone was looking down their noses at us. And people just don't experience that accessibility that Deborah was showing here. She wasn't putting things in the way and barriers. She created an open place, a level place that people could come to her, and then she would listen to what God had to say and then was able to apply that to those that she was speaking with. So what can we learn and apply just from that part of her life? So Deborah demonstrates the importance of meeting people where they are. Rather than waiting for others to come to her, Deborah sat under that tree, where the Israelites came for wisdom, for guidance and justice. She listened to their concerns, she discerned God's direction, and she helped them to take the next steps. Her example reminds us of how we should all be, being available, being approachable, and willing to engage with people in the midst of their circumstances. We may not be a judge, but we can apply Deborah's example by first listening and then speaking, offering wise counsel without judgment, and walking alongside others to help them grow in faith. Whether that's in our families, whether that's in our workplaces, whether it's here, whether it's in our communities, our neighbourhoods, no matter where we are, we can help them to move closer to God one step at a time. Now let's get back to the story of how Deborah and God uses Deborah to save his people. So as I said, 20 years under oppression by King Jabin, and his commander was Sisera, and he controlled an army of 900 ironclad chariots. And the people cried out to God to be saved. So Deborah was leading people at this time. She was one of the judges. And God answered by speaking a very specific word and an action plan to defeat Jabin's army. So Deborah calls for Barak, and he's one of the military commanders at the time, and she shares a prophecy with him. And you can read it in Judges 4, 6-9. And this is what God says. The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take your 10,000 men out of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them up the Mount of Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River and give him into your hands. But Barak said to her, if you go with me, I'll go, but if you don't go with me, I won't. Certainly I will go with you, said Deborah. But because of the course you are taking, the honour will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. Now, if you notice, Deborah has a very balanced response. She didn't jump straight into judgment when Barak said, well, I'll only go if you go with me. And she didn't take a, fine, I'll just do it myself approach. She immediately said, of course I'll go with you. She listened to what God's response, because that's not your natural human response. It was God's response coming through her. So she agrees to go with Barak, but then she outlines what the consequence of his lack of faith is. So Deborah, Barak, and the 10,000 troops head to Kadesh. Sisera gets wind of this approach, and he then launches his 900 chariots armed with iron, and they go to destroy Barak's army, also they think. So Deborah remains at Barak's side, and before they advance, she says, again God's words, which is in Judges 4, verse 14, go, this is the day of the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you? So Barak went down to Mount Tabor with his 10,000 men following him. So as the 10,000 men are attacking and wiping out the army, Sisera realises that they were losing. So he decides to leg it and get out of there. So Sisera then goes and finds safety in Jael's tent, which is a family that is known to be the alliance with King Jabin. Now, remember, God had said to him what the consequence was for not just obeying his command. And he said that Sisera would be delivered into the hands of a woman. Just a warning, if you're not good with crazy things, you may want to put fingers in your ears in a little bit. I'll warn you again. Jael gave Sisera some warm milk, tucks him up into bed, and he goes off into a deep sleep. Fingers in your ears if you're squeamish. She then gets a tent peg and rams it through his head into the ground, and that's the end of Sisera. So Barak then realises, so he's still in the throes of the battle, realises that Sisera has disappeared. So he then goes to find out where he's gone. And this is when Jael comes out and says to Barak, come with me takes him into the tent to see that Sisera has indeed been killed. So God had heard the Israelites cry, and through Deborah listening to God, he delivered them from King Jabin. And there was a further 40 years of peace during that time before the story of Gideon starts in chapter 6. So it's a really exciting story. And just Deborah shows her bravery, her faith, and just absolute trust in God. The fight still proceeded, but before, during, and after, she let God lead her and guide her words and deed. Now, she did that because she'd experienced and known God's faithfulness. She would have likely seen many, many disputes and upsets. But instead of reacting from a human standpoint, which is shown time and time again in this story, she would listen to God and allow his guiding. And so clearly depicted in this story, with the potential of significant, in our own mindset, going into a battle of 900 chariots covered in iron didn't seem realistic. But she knew, and she had faith that he was going to answer. So what does that mean for us today? No matter what we're going through, God is with us. If we sit and listen, as Deborah did, and respond in how God would want us to, so we're not quick to speak or quick to argue, that we don't respond from our own personal view, but from what God is saying to us. Not only in our everyday exchanges, but also in our decision making for our futures, where we're going to live, what career path we may take, what things to share with your family, how to spend your life, who to spend your life with, who to build close relationships with, who to intercede for, what neighbourhood should you be serving, and maybe where your focus should be during retirement. No matter what it is, we can come to God and listen to his voice, because he's the one that's going to direct us. We can spend time listening to God as Deborah did, and we can listen to his instructions. We can be bold and brave because we can trust in God. We can use God's wisdom in our lives and how we engage with others. And I think it's key to hear that it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're old, young, male, female, it doesn't matter, because the consistent part is that God is in control, and it is God where we seek our guidance from. So I just encourage you, and if you think we move on to that story in Gideon, who then felt like he was a failure, it doesn't matter how you think about it, God is going to use you, and we just need to be open to that. So let us all be like Deborah, and not stand in our own strength or abilities, but draw close to God and listen to his word. We can stand in God's wisdom and truth in every moment,